Thank you so much for being here today. As you are entering in the space, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves with your name, pronouns, where you're joining us from. If you are familiar with our webinars from the DEI side of the house, if you want to share something you're geeking out about, we would love to hear that as well. I'll go ahead and start. My name is Akiana. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm the public programs manager here at She Geeks Out. And I'm currently geeking about Pilates because I just love Pilates. It's a part of my daily Thursday practice, and it's just a great way to start the day. But I'm really excited to be here with you all and introduce our partner at Building People, Krista, and excited to talk to you about what workforce training grants are, which ones are available, and what does the process even look like to start applying for one. And then once you get the grant, how do you move forward and actually participate in training? So without further ado, Krista, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you, but thank you all so much for being here. There will be time for questions and answers later in the session, but as the session goes on, if you have any questions or comments about the slides that you're seeing, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll be Krista's eyes on the chat throughout the session, so making sure that she either answers the question during the session itself or during that question and answer. But Krista, right over to you.
All right, and I will do my best to do that same introduction. So Krista Van Ranst here, founder and learning business partner of Building People. The PPL actually stands for people. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And was it just something geeking out about, or was there something else that I missed? Okay, so right now I am currently reading a book on deep work and the concept of trying to find ways that you can kind of have 3 to 4 blocked hours of time, which I think for many of us is like feels impossible, where we have no distractions and can really do some of our best work to be incredibly successful. So I'm currently reading that book. It's pretty good. I'm only a couple pages in, but I'm excited for what that potential has down the line. Good to see all of you, and for those of you coming in. So today we're here to talk about training grants and the fact that most of your companies are already paying into these funds already. And so you might as well take advantage of those funds to allow you to get more training dollars for your organization and potentially for you to take advantage of as well as employees of those organizations. And so just wanting to give a huge thank you to She Geeks Out for partnering with us on this webinar and being able to share out this amazing opportunity, and also to just continue to get the word out. We often laugh that, the training grants are government organizations and they don't have the funds from a marketing perspective to share all that information out. So we love it when we can share out the information out and get these funds to as many organizations as possible. Just a quick kind of plug for us. It makes me super uncomfortable, but I'm told to do it by our marketing team that so far 100% of the grants that we've applied for, we have been approved for, awarded for our clients. And so we are incredibly humbled and excited by that. But more importantly, that helps from a client perspective that we've had a chance to award our employees and our clients with over $4 million in training funds. And so there's lots of money out there, and we want you to take advantage of it. For intents and purposes of the webinar today, our goal in talking with She Geeks Out was to kind of focus on 3 states. However, do know that there are training funds available in every state across the country. I'll talk about this more, but the whole idea behind training grants and why they exist is that they are a proactive form of unemployment. So when I said earlier that all of you are paying into it already, you're paying into unemployment. And there's 2 different opportunities from an unemployment perspective, right? There's reactive unemployment and proactive unemployment. And what I mean by that is that reactive unemployment means that you lay someone off and the economy around them still needs to exist in some way, shape, or form. And so they're given some sort of severance, right? And whereas proactive unemployment, the government is saying, you know what? If we give companies funds to train their people, even if they lay them off, those people are going to have more skills. And ideally, if they have more skills, they'll be able to be rehired somewhere else. Or if we give training to these companies to train if we give funds to these companies to train their people, they are going to become more proficient in their job, or the company is going to be more proficient in the work that they do. They're going to do the job better, and then they're going to hire more people, thus reducing unemployment. So when I think about it from a political perspective, I often say that training grants tend to be a little bit of a purple approach, that they're giving the funds to companies, which has maybe a bit of more of a red Republican side, but they're doing it specifically for the people with the goal of increasing skills. And so I like when those two sides can come together and have a little bit more of a purple approach. Back to the slide here, when we're talking about Massachusetts, New York City, and California. After this webinar, I will share this presentation, and these are linked. So if you want to get more additional information, you'll be able to access the links to each of these grant websites for additional information. A couple of quick notes. Massachusetts is the only one here that has 2 grants. They have an express grant, which is a maximum of $20,000. And that is only for companies under 100 employees. And then the Commonwealth Corp General Grant, that one is for any size company. You could be under 100, or you could be over 100. And the maximum is 200,000. And we'll get to some of the additional pieces here in a moment, but I just wanted to make a note of that. There are some nuances to the 2 different grants, and if we have time, we'll definitely get into those further. But my goal here today is to overall talk about these grants, what they're like, and some of the nuances, so that if you all wanted to go and apply yourselves, you have a lot more knowledge and information to do that. And if you need some additional help, we can be there to help you as well. All right, so around the general grant, so that wouldn't include the Massachusetts Express grant, but it would include New York City, it would include California, and it would include the Massachusetts General Grant. Often, the idea behind these grants are that you are thinking about your training in a 1 to 2 year time frame. So you're not just thinking about like one session at a time. You're trying to think a little bit bigger picture of like, what training do I want to do over the next year or 2, which can be quite a bit. The applications can range from as small as 10 grand to up to kind of 400,000 or 500,000. For New York City, that range is 30,000 to 400,000, and theirs is a 1 year scale, that time frame. Massachusetts is 10,000 to 200,000. Theirs is a 2 year time frame, and California's can range up to 500,000, and they must be completed within about 21 months. So it's just a little under 2 years. All 3 of those grants are you can apply for on a rolling basis. So there is not a specific open period where you can apply. I will say that there's often the comment that if they run out of funds for that year, they may close it up and then start the next year. That hasn't happened in the 15 years that I've been doing it. That has not happened for those 3 states. However, there are other states within the United States that do have kind of open enrollment periods where you have to apply during those timeframes. From a timing perspective, often I would recommend acknowledging that you'll probably need up to between 60 and 90 days to apply for this. So it is a process. While I would love to say it's free money and it's easy to get to, it's not as easy as we might want it to be. And it does take some time. The state doesn't just want to give out these funds willy-nilly. They do want to make sure that people are really putting in some thought behind the trainings that they want, and so that they can measure them. And so we often say, we can apply for a training grant within as quickly as 30 days. And most states take up to 60 days to approve it. So even after if you're able to apply within 30 days, get the application going, and then you submit it, it can take another 2 months for the state to review it, approve it, and get everything going. So just something to be thinking about, that at this point, if you're thinking about applying, you're thinking about applying for 2024 and potentially 2025. And then last but not least, a big piece of these training grants is around the choosing of vendors. And so if you want to do all of your training in-house, The states are not going to be as excited by that. Some of the states will be a little bit more open to it, but that it's harder for states to measure the cost of those trainings and how many hours that were incurred versus if you had a vendor that sent you an invoice, there's a more of a surety that that training took place. And the last thing I'll say is that no family members can be vendors for a lot of these, family members mostly being like family members of executives in the organization. All right. So what are these grants looking for? You're like, all right, Krista, you talked me into it. I can get $400,000, $500,000 from my company. Like, I'm in. What do we have to do? So that's where we talk about a little bit more here. The big thing, and I mentioned the proactive unemployment already. The big thing that the states want to understand is how are these trainings going to affect the business? How are they going to align with the business goals or objectives that they currently have? And so oftentimes clients will reach out to us and they'll say, we want to do a manager development training. And we say, great, that's awesome. Why? We'll say, well, because all of our employees have, grown up in this organization and none of them have had formal training. Great. Still need to understand why. We need to have some like real business goals or measurable metrics that we can associate with that to say, okay, currently, maybe it's 60% of our managers have never been trained. And because of that, our engagement scores are X, Y, and Z. And so ideally, we want to do this training and with the goal that 100% of our managers will be formally trained and our engagement scores will increase to Z. Right. And so they like whatever those measurements need to be, it's really important that you have them for any of these states, any of these grants. That's something that we can help with, but like just understanding any of those goals. If you think about turnover, if you think about, like I said, engagement scores, you can think about technology utilization rates. You can think about money saved or like major expenses that were unanticipated and wanting to reduce those. The goals can be anything. They do, like, it could be around, if you're a biotech company, it could be around getting out, like going to the next phase in that drug. Right. And so there's lots of different ideas. I would say I almost hate giving examples, but I often feel that it's necessary because I don't want you to limit your thinking. As long as there are metrics, if we can figure out a way to measure those business goals, then you more than likely can find some training to associate it with the goal of having a different outcome after the training has taken place. And then obviously making sure that we are aligning those goals with the training that we have. So if, for example, if we use that management training and instead we say, oh, we're going to do an Excel 101 class, like our goal is to increase our managers' knowledge of managing, and we're going to do that with an Excel 101 class. I'm sure there's a story there, but it's not as easily to align. And so making sure as best as possible that we're saying, hey, this is the goal we want to achieve. This is the training we want to do. And this is how that training aligns to that goal. So I'll keep going unless there are any questions. Akiana, do we have any questions in the chat specifically around this? Okay.
Nope, not yet.
Once again, my goal here is to give you as many tools as possible to be successful if you are going to go off on this on your own. And so a couple of things that states love and a few things that they don't love, right? And so if we think about the fact of proactive unemployment, all of these training opportunities, any that can affect your lowest paid employees, those are ones that states are going to say, yes, that's great. We would love to be able to upskill those folks, right? We'd love the benchmark of our state as a whole, of our lowest skilled employees, our lowest paid employees. We'd love to be able to bring that up because that shows that we can be a place that provides living wages in our state. So that's something that whether it's computer basics, think about some of the lowest paid employees and maybe areas that they struggle, any training that those folks could do would be a real win-win for a lot of these states from a training grant perspective. English as a second language, same thing. The states love those. I will say that New York, not New York, New York City has a training grant. New York State, they don't love English language, but New York City does. And so we know that most of the folks here pertain to the New York City group. So we kind of kept that one separately. Any sort of computer literacy skills training, any training on new technology and equipment, we know that it provides efficiency, and that often if people can't understand and be able to kind of stay on top of technology, it is a part of our lives, whether we want it to be or not. It can have the downside of folks being laid off if they can't stay up to date on technology. So that's always a big win. And then DE&I initiatives as well. And we'll speak in a little later to She Geeks Out and some of the programs that they offer. Things that they don't love: one-on-one coaching specifically for executives. With that in mind, if we once again think about the proactive unemployment, highlight level executives, it can be assumed that they have quite a few skills. And so paying additional funds out of state money for them to get additional skills is not the highest need for these state grants, right? They may offer, like it's okay for your executives to participate in any of these trainings, but their goal as a state and from a training grant perspective around proactive unemployment is not specifically to help high-level executives get additional training. So one-on-one coaching in particular is more than likely off the list for all states. For Massachusetts only, the training can't cost more than $350 an hour, or what I should actually say is that's an incorrect statement, that the state isn't willing to pay more than $350 an hour. So as we know, a lot of these programs, their training programs, aren't as inexpensive as that. And so if you had a program that was $700 an hour, what you would do there is you would say, Massachusetts, we're asking the state to pay 50% of this program, and we'll pay the remaining 50% out of pocket. So whatever that number is, just keep that $350 number in mind, that anything over that, you're going to have to pay out of pocket. The state doesn't mind at all. They kind of are like, oh, you want to pay some of it, you're putting some skin in the game. Awesome. But it is the number that they've had. I will say they haven't changed it in the 15 years. And so I keep nudging to say like, hey, can we go up a little bit further on some of these numbers, because a lot of vendors are charging more and more in that regard. We have a little asterisk here next to the course materials and custom development hours. Oftentimes, course materials, depending on the expense, can be covered and depending on what it is, whereas custom development hours often are not covered in the overall training grants. And so that might be something that you have to pay for out of pocket. Or ideally, my recommendation is always to try and see if you can negotiate with that vendor to get that included in the overall price. So that's a little freebie tip on that. Like, always try and negotiate that custom development if you can. A big note that we get asked pretty regularly is whether or not the wages for the employees. So while your employees are in training, can the state pay for those people's salaries while they're in the training? And the answer is no. So oftentimes these states are looking at kind of what is considered a 1-to-1 match, that the state's willing to give you $200,000 as long as you're willing to kind of put $200,000 in. And in particular for Massachusetts, but for many of our states, that just means that you're paying the salaries of your employees. And more than likely, you'll get to that 1-to-1 match just by paying the salaries of your employees while they're in training. Either way, it is a no-go for all of them, that you cannot get funds to pay your employees their salary while they're in training. That is assumed that you will do that. Any training that is started prior to the contract term, that is not allowed. So you are only thinking about doing training that is after your grant has been awarded. And then they also don't pay for any vendor travel expenses. So if you're in New York City and you have a vendor coming from Chicago, you're going to have to pay for their flight, but all other expenses, the actual cost of the program can be utilized in the training grant. So those are some of the things that they love and don't love. I'm going to skip this slide for now, and we can come back to it if there are questions. This is our overall timeline of the process and like the steps that we tend to take to ensuring that we have the business goals in place, understanding those business goals, researching the right vendors, understanding who would participate in drafting the grant. We can get back to this later because I'm assuming that there might be more questions then, and I don't want to focus too heavily on this now. All right, and now I'm going to pass it over to Fatima to kind of speak for some of the different programs that She Geeks Out has.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Krista. And lovely just to continue learning about all the opportunities that are out there. And so I love what Krista just shared, because when you talk about things that the grant loves, that's where we fall into play. So my name is Fatima. I am the director of training at She Geeks Out, and we work to abolish inequity in the workplace. I know that's a lofty mission, and the way we try doing that is through our programming. So before I even talk about our programming, we're going to drop a link in the chat so that you all have access to how we think about training and how we think about our theory of change, right? And I say that to say, we know that our workforce continues to change, and we know that in order for people to feel like they want to stay at our workplaces, to feel like they belong, to feel like they're included, we do need some training to make sure that we are creating those spaces for folks. And so that's where we come into play, because at SGO, She Geeks Out, we believe that it's really necessary to take a holistic approach. Similar to what Krista was saying earlier, it's not just about having one workshop or one webinar. It's really thinking about the journey, because we know shifts and changes within our workplaces take time. And so when you're thinking about applying for this grant or thinking about bringing training into the space, we are very much in alignment with what Krista was sharing. And if you're a company that's either starting your DEI journey, or you're somewhere in the middle, or you're like, okay, we've done a lot, but you want to continue to sustain your efforts, we offer an array of opportunities. So in the first column, you see workshops. Hopefully folks can see that. If not, the first column says workshops. And this is where we talk about the different topics that are needed to create those inclusive, respectful communities and workplaces. We have a lot of workshops that exist. Because of time, I won't go through all of them, but I've highlighted a few that's here that a lot of our clients often choose because they know that some of these foundational workshops are very important. So whether we're thinking about just the foundations of DEI, this is a great workshop for anybody who really needs a refresher, or you need some language to really understand, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean at your workplace and organization? How do you define that? And also, what are some ways that you can begin to understand how those efforts or those definitions can be impacted, both positively and negatively? So we talk about that in that workshop. Another workshop that a lot of our clients like is around understanding and addressing microaggressions, but also how do you become an ally in the workplace? So some of the skills that come out of that workshop is being able to identify bias and microaggressions if and when they show up, not just in the interpersonal spaces, but in the hiring and recruiting strategies, for example, or in management style. We know that bias, we all have biases, so we really take our time in identifying what are some of those biases that research shows that often come up in our workplaces, and then what are some systems and structures that we can put into play, but then also what are some practices that individuals can take on. Another one of our popular courses in the workshop space is creating an inclusive culture. And this is where we really give people the opportunity to understand, what does it actually mean to have an inclusive workplace? What are some of those key components that you need so that your employees have the choice if they want to not only bring their authentic selves. I know we've been hearing that phrase a lot, and that's why I say choice, but to not only have the choice to bring their authentic selves to the workplace, but to also feel like they can share feedback, give feedback, receive feedback. All of these mechanisms, research show, are really important for not just employee engagement, but to have those relationships that make our employees want to stay and grow in other areas. All of our workshops start at 2 hours usually, and we sometimes do programs as well. So for example, our Creating an Inclusive Culture workshop is actually a 2-part workshop. So the first part is 2 hours, and the second part is 2 hours, a total of 4 hours, where we go in between theory and practice. We know that it's not just enough to talk about what we want to do, but to also start practicing what we want to do. So I know Akiana has shared some links in the chat. If you want to learn more about some of these workshops or even beyond some of these workshops, you have an opportunity to do so. I want to move on to webinars, which is the second column. And usually our webinars are anywhere from 60 minutes to 90 minutes. And this is a great way to either sustain the work that you've already done, and you're sort of what I like to call bringing in injections of DEI work. So maybe you've already done DEI trainings, you've done some of the foundational pieces that I talked about earlier, but you want to continue making sure that your employees are learning more about best practices or effective practices in the DEI space. For example, how do you become an inclusive manager? Specifically around neurodiversity. Okay, I know that neurodiversity is a conversation that is continuing to grow in the DEI space, and really thinking about the fact that we all come into the workplace with different identities, different backgrounds. And so some things that probably worked 10 years ago, 20 years ago, such as like how we onboard our employees or what are some of the instructions we give to our colleagues, maybe some of those things were normalized, but it doesn't mean that it was inclusive. And so having a webinar around neurodiversity, for example, really helps us understand, first of all, what is neurodiversity, how ableism can sometimes show up in our workplaces, and what are some of those practices that we can start incorporating in our workplaces so that folks who do identify as neurodivergent are not necessarily experiencing ableism to the extent that they have in the past, right? There's always going to be room to grow as we learn, but that's an example of what that webinar could be about. Another example of our webinars is emotional intelligence. Again, we know that majority of leaders who are successful are emotionally intelligent. And I appreciate what Krista said earlier, where for the most part, you know, when you're looking at that grant around things they love and things they don't love, most of the time you do expect leaders to have enough skills to be able to even be in the space of leadership. But we also think about leadership across the board. So it's not just folks who are CEOs or on leadership level, but leadership within how folks lead in their own roles. And so emotional intelligence, our webinar really explores why it's important to have that form of intelligence, but what does it actually look like to have emotional intelligence with your colleagues? What does it look like to be self-aware of your own emotions and how that might impact your relationships at work? Another example of our webinars is building anti-racist workplaces. It's probably one of my favorites just because I talk about it a lot. But within our webinars, what you can probably see is that we try to get very specific about a core topic because of the short time that we have. And so in that webinar, for example, we take our time to really understand what is racism, how does it manifest in the workplace, but more specifically, what can we do? So in that webinar, we go through some liberatory practices. We talk about different ways of working, of being, and showing up. So again, the goal is to abolish inequity in the workplace. So we try to help employees gain some of those skills in their day-to-day so they're not intentionally or unintentionally perpetuating systems of oppression or harm. In our last column, one of my other favorites, maybe I love everything about She Geeks Out, which is why I work here, is really thinking about consulting. So we know that, first of all, DEI work is not a one size fits all, and our workshops are not a one size fits all either. But we want to start thinking about DEI as change management work. So if we're using that framework, the consulting piece is key, because it's not just about signing up for a workshop or multiple workshops or a program, but it's about having a comprehensive and holistic approach to help bolster some of your DEI efforts and initiatives. So our consulting support can vary depending on what companies and organizations need. For example, we support companies to administer a survey, and you specifically using a DEIB survey. So folks can put a 1 in the chat if you have either taken an employee engagement survey or if you have been part of the team that administers that survey. Are folks in the room that have done either or? Okay. All right, I see a few ones in the chat. Awesome. So a few of you probably know what I'm talking about when I say the employee engagement survey. And it's sort of similar with our DIB survey, but we try to use a lens where we support you in understanding where are the strengths. So we use a strengths-based approach. It's not just about the gaps, though we will get there, but where are the strengths? Where are you thriving within your organization as it relates to DEI? And where are there some potential challenges that we might see? And as folks who've been doing this work for decades, we can say, here are some of the practices or some of the potential solutions that might help address or mitigate some of the issues that are coming up. That's one way we support our clients with consulting. Another way is through our equity tool analysis. This is really helpful for leaders who have decision-making power, and you know there might be some challenges or issues, and you really want to be at the forefront of managing and leading change at your organization. And so our equity tool analysis allows leaders within organizations to take a moment and think about, you know, what's working, what's not working, and then to create or co-create a strategic plan. So we're working with a current client now where we've done both steps. We've done the assessment, we've done the equity tool analysis. We provided them with a report of where their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are, in addition to a detailed outline of what it is that we can support them with as it relates to training. So again, a comprehensive approach, right? It's not just the training, it's just the data, it's how do all of these things come together for us to propose a solid plan. And then we work with some of our clients for a year, not just with some of the training opportunities that I just mentioned earlier, but also with checking in with where they are in their DEI goals. So we do quarterly check-ins. We say, hey, we said we would do these 3 things. Where are we right now? What do you need support in? How can we support you? And so all of these opportunities exist at She Geeks Out. I can honestly keep going, but I think this is a good overview, or at least an understanding of the different ways that we can support your company as it relates to DEI work. Feel free, or I invite you to check out some of those links that we're sharing in the chat if you want to learn more. But I'll pause if there were any questions that might have come up that I missed, Akiana.
Awesome. And a couple of things that I'll mention that you brought to light that I wanted to kind of speak to. So from a training grant perspective, column 1, column 2, workshops, webinars, 100% can be included in training grants. When it comes to consulting, that's where things get a little gray. And so I would always say, like, consulting is probably not going to be something that would be a training grant. However, if there are training hours in there, you can, and you know, the client or the vendor is willing to separate those out, those can be covered in the training grant. And Fatima, you brought up a really good point around like management, in particular around emotional intelligence, right? Just to be clear, like the state very much allows for management training and executive training, like new manager training in particular, as you were mentioning, like the kind of some of the different layers, for sure, is a really valuable tool, and a lot of training grants are okay with that. Just quickly, I had mentioned for the Massachusetts that I would speak to the Express grant. quickly, and I wanted to talk about it here. So a 1-year grant, you can have, it's up to $20,000. It used to be 30 and they've recently reduced it down to 20,000. You can apply whenever. The fun part about the Express grant, and She Geeks Out is on it, so that's also why I want to mention it here, is that if you have like 1 or 2 people that wants to apply for maybe an open enrollment program or these one-off programs, the Express grant is a great way to do that because you can apply just for one training at a time. You may remember from earlier on the slides, I said that you're thinking about it from like a long period of time, like a year's worth of training. Whereas if you wanted to just do 1 or 2 workshops, and we're in Massachusetts as a company under 100 employees, you could apply for these different trainings, and you could apply for, say each one of them is $2,000. You could have 10 different people go for $2,000 each to be that 20,000. Or maybe you can get a group rate and have additional people go. So it's definitely something to look into. It's also a really fast turnaround. Only 21 days you can apply and literally be sitting butts in seats in a training 21 days after you apply for that Express grant. The one caveat, as you can see, is that you can only choose vendors that are already on the directory. And so, like I said, She Geeks Out is already on there for some of their programs. Definitely something to look into. And after this webinar, we can have Akiana send over some of the, like a quick link to the Express grant and how you can search for those programs. But there are hundreds or even thousands of other vendors on there as well. I will always note that some of them are amazing. Some of them maybe just know about the program and have added themselves, and they may not be the best vendor. So it's definitely a good idea to do some due diligence around those vendors when you're thinking about the Express grant. Quickly, a couple of things about our services, and then I want to jump into a case study from one of our clients that has used both She Geeks Out and our grant writing and be able to speak to that. So we provide outsourced learning and development for small and medium-sized businesses as small as 10 people and as large as 250. If you don't have a learning and development department or team and feel that you need one, feel free to reach out. As we're here today, we help with training grants, specifically for organizations across the country. We love it when it can align with that small and medium-sized business that we feel very strongly about as a part of our overall mission in helping those small businesses, but we have helped other organizations that are larger as well. And then we do have a facilitation arm. So if you ever are in need of new manager training, that is an area that we can help you with also. All right, so I'm going to bring Carly up on the stage if we have a moment, and I will stop sharing my screen so you can we can see one another here and have a chance to kind of quickly chat about the IKENA training grant. How are you?
Great, thank you, Krista. So my name is Carly Andrews Balbuena. My pronouns is she, hers. And really excited to talk a little bit more about working with Building People. We also use She Geeks Out as one of our vendors through the workforce training grant, and we have absolutely loved it thus far. We applied for the grant last year, and it was such a smooth process. But yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit more about the process.
Yeah, so talk to what about the process, I guess, like from a grant writing perspective, did you feel that the process, like what made it easy?
Man, you guys are just so on top of it. Honestly, going into a grant, this is my second grant with Building People, and from the first and second time, I am not an expert by any means. So it was so nice to have someone that truly knew from start to finish exactly what they're looking for in a grant and how we could tailor our story to make sure that our grant not only gave really great options for our employees, but also it tied back into our goals, which honestly our C-suite really loved to hear as well, that we were tying that learning and development back to our goals as the company. So just having someone that's extremely knowledgeable about the process, in terms of what they're looking for, but also providing great recommendations for vendors. I mean, the vendor research takes so much time. and vetting. So to have, you know, two experts who have talked to all of these vendors and can truly speak to what it's like to work with them and just their overall experiences was so incredibly valuable. And also I can be a little bit chaotic as a person. So having that guidance from building people about constantly, you know, asking if there's anything they could do on their side and keeping me up to date was, again, so incredibly helpful.
And then let's kind of transition over, and then I want to leave a few minutes for questions. And we have a couple last slides, I think, but nothing crazy. I want to leave as much time for questions as we can. However, so like in thinking about, so you know, you get awarded this grant, you have to have the vendors already chosen. One of those vendors was She Geeks Out, and then now you have to go and actually schedule the trainings, right? Because they're not scheduled. And so talk to us about, like, upon award of the grant, what that process looked like, and also being able to connect and start working with the vendors.
Yeah. So the transition was honestly seamless. So from the time we got awarded the grant, you know, Building People was very, very on it, you know, in terms of connecting me with someone at the training grant, I don't know, quarters. Vendor, yeah. So we got like a full summary from Building People about exactly what we were approved for, and exactly what, you know, what sessions that would be included in our grant. We then had someone reach out to us from the Workforce Training Grant, who scheduled like an initial 45-minute call, and they went over, you know, everything that we would need to turn into them on a quarterly or yearly basis, how the reimbursement process went. And then Paige from Building People even followed up with me and offered to join any of those calls, answer any questions. And then from a facilitation standpoint, Paige connected me with every single one of the vendors, gave a summary, you know, wrote that we were approved for their trainings, and was able to seamlessly transition me to be able to facilitate with the actual vendors to start those trainings as soon as possible, or as soon as the grant would allow. And Paige even worked with me to build a scheduled timeline of when we could, you know, potentially have these trainings. Obviously not exact dates, but again, just a great timeline of what to expect when we would be doing those trainings, and connecting me with the right people at those companies to just get started as soon as possible.
Love it. And how many trainings, where are you at now? Like, are you halfway through?
Yes. So we have done, goodness, about 5 or 6 of our scheduled trainings. So we've done a portion of our She Geeks Out training. So our entire DEI committee went through like a series of 6 workshops, but they were like 4-hour sessions for a couple of weeks, and it gave our DEI committee like a sense of, you know, what our philosophy would be going forward. We established an entire committee structure. And honestly, it's just great as like a self-appointed DEI committee to really understand what it means to be a diverse, equitable, and inclusive employer. And actually next month we have She Geeks Out doing a next portion of our training for a company-wide diversity, equity, and inclusion foundations training. But we've also used it for Harvard Medical School courses for some of our scientists and non-scientists who are just interested in learning more about our science. So yeah, about halfway through, and we have done a lot of learning and development this year.
I love it. I love it. Other questions from the quote unquote audience that we have for Carly while we have her? I want to allow you to take as much advantage of it as you possibly can, of having her here, to be able to kind of hear from someone who's lived it. Well, we'll keep that open if anyone does have questions, because I know sometimes it takes a moment to get into the chat. So Carly, would you mind staying on till the end just in case people have questions for you?
Of course.
Right. Awesome. So I will share my screen again here. Once again, as I mentioned, we'll share these slides afterwards with She Geeks Out, so they will share that out. And here is our contact information. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out. We would happily, answer any smaller questions or larger questions, whatever you have. And then we've left the time for questions. So I did a couple of people send some advanced questions. So I wanted to start with that. While I'm answering these 2 questions, feel free to write some questions in the chat, and then Akiana can help me make that happen, so we can answer any of the questions that have come throughout this time frame. So one of the first questions that I got was how to convince managers or a dean/CEO to invest in training for employees. And so I love this question. One, because like the grants is an easy way to convince them, right? Like, listen, rather than investing $400,000 or $200,000, like we only have to invest 10 grand, and we have this potential to, get all of these funds. And so from a CEO's perspective, if they're being frugal or not understanding the value of training grants is an easy win to be like, hey, if I can get a part of it paid for, would you be more willing to apply for those funds, right? It's kind of a win-win. The other thing that I think is really helpful in the grant writing process is that you're aligning those those trainings to business goals. And so one example that I've used in the past is like one of my clients had $2.4 million in major losses that they spent the previous year. And we were asking questions of like, where did those losses come from? Like, how are $2.4 million in unanticipated expenses seems high? Like, what would change that? How could we reduce that? And they kept saying over and over again, communication. Like, it was just a lack of communication. And so I kept saying, like, so just so I'm clear, if we roll out a communications training, that is going to reduce the major losses. And they said yes. And so I said, okay, I'm gonna add a communications training to this grant, but like there's nothing else. And they're like, no. And so we did this communications training. It was actually a 2-day communications training. So it's really intense, because think about the money that they were just throwing out the window. For, I don't remember how many groups, we'll say like 6 or 10 groups. So that's almost like 60 to 100 people. Their major losses within 2 years went down to $700,000. So, I mean, like right there, the company, well, they spent, we'll say $100,000, they saved 1.6, because if you think about the 2.6 minus the 700 plus the 100,000 that they spent, like that's a pretty good return on investment. And so it's hard for CEOs to see that there might not be value in that from a training perspective. The other question that I have here, is it okay to find training grants for employees to help them professionally into another career? This person said, I work in higher ed and career growth is non-existent, which I always think is a bummer for people in higher ed. Either way, you have to leave the university to go to another higher education institution or leave higher ed completely to get a job. And so what I'll say there is that as long as the skills that you're learning can be aligned with your current company goals, maybe you have, like, we'll use the management example. Maybe someone that's not going to be a manager it has an interest in learning management skills. As long as the business as a whole has some measurable goals or objectives around management training, you can add that person into that management training, right? Carly's example, maybe you have some overall business goals around, like from a scientist perspective that she mentioned, Harvard Medical, those programs, and enhancing your skills around different kind of biotech, like acronyms and all of the science behind it. I am definitely not the scientist person. So, if it's a group program and you're sending, like 8 people are going, oftentimes put a couple more people in there, and the vendor won't mind having 1 or 2 additional folks. So you can't necessarily be that intentional of like, we want this person gone and we're going to train them to leave. But if it can align with the company goals and objectives, and just adding that person into a couple of programs, by all means, the state is happy to have. The more the merrier if you're paying the same amount anyway. All right, Akiana, what other questions do we have?
Yeah, we got some great questions in the chat. So someone was asking and wondering who can apply for a given state. So for example, can you only apply to the state funds in which you're headquartered in, or can you apply for any state in which you have employees in, even if the funds granted could be used for employees in other states?
And I think I may have seen like something around like remote work, and that one, that's where things get tricky. So the way that state grants work are that like wherever your remote employees are, you may not know this, but more than likely your payroll provider or the person in benefits and payroll that is at your organization, they are having to apply for payroll in each state. So whether you are a company that doesn't have a headquarters and is just has people all over, those states, your organization is paying different payroll, different unemployment into each of those states, which is funneling those funds to these specific grants. For the Express grant, if you have any Massachusetts employees who are remote and you want them to go to certain trainings, by all means, that's an easy one from an Express grant perspective. However, I will say it does get trickier. My recommendation would be that if you have a larger group of folks in one state, my recommendation would be to apply in that state. Once again, and that, like what I had mentioned before, is like maybe you have some people that are virtual and you're going to do a webinar, for example, on a training. More than likely, the vendor is going to charge you a flat rate for that training. And so we'll say that that training is $500, just for ease of math. And you've got 8 people in one location, but you have like another 10 in different locations. If that vendor doesn't mind having like the 18 people in the webinar and it's virtual, the state where you have those 8 folks can pay for that training. And then, like I said, more the merrier. Folks from those other states can participate, but you can't ask the state. We'll use an example, like you can't ask Massachusetts to pay for someone who lives in New York City as an open enrollment. It has to just be you're saying, okay, we're asking the state to pay for these 8 people to come. And then if more people come in addition to those 8 from Massachusetts, that's fine. It's a great question. And it is one that we get often. And it's like, I'm a big believer in the more the merrier, as long as there's like a cap from a vendor perspective. Feel like the state would happily know, oh my goodness, our funds are going to provide training to additional people. You have to focus it on the folks that are in that state. And then any additional are just a bonus.
Awesome. Thank you, Krista. Another question that was submitted a couple times. Are these grants available to nonprofits as well as for-profit businesses or even professional organizations?
Yeah. So from a nonprofit perspective, for Massachusetts, I don't think it is for California or New York City. I will get back to you on that. And I can send a response. So Akiana, if you want to share that and when you follow up, I will have that. For Massachusetts, it's a little tricky. Most of the time it's no for nonprofits. Other times it's depending on how you're paying payroll. And so if you're paying into unemployment, even though you're a nonprofit, you can apply. So it's dependent on how your payroll is set up as a nonprofit provider here in Massachusetts.
Great, thank you. And then the $350 max per hour, does this mean that the price shown on the directory isn't necessarily fully covered? Would it only be up to $350 an hour that is covered?
Yeah, so Express Grant is a little bit different. You don't have to worry as much about that $350 an hour mark. The things that you have to know for the Express Grant is that if, for example, maybe it says that the flat rate for a group is $4,000, all of that could be covered. If it's anything over $20,000, so there are programs that are like multiple days and might be $36,000. If it says that the cost is $36,000, the state will pay for $20,000 of it. The other thing is that per employee, if there is a program that is over $3,000 per person, the state will only pay $3,000 per person. And so everything else I think is in there and can probably be fully reimbursed. However, those two things to keep in mind: anything over 20 grand can't be covered. Only up to that $20,000, and then only up to $3,000 per person. And so if you had like, even if you had one person going through multiple trainings, we'll say Fatima's going through 3 different trainings, one of them is $2,000, one of them is $1,000, another one is $500. That $500, they would say, you know what, that person has already gone through too many trainings. They can't get approved for that last one.
Awesome.
Great question.
And then,
Loving it.
yeah, they're really good questions. We have about 3 more, but I noticed we're coming up on time. So, Krista, you good if I roll through these next few? Okay, great.
I'll do speed round.
Awesome. So do you find that the prices of the workshops in the directory are inflated? Or why are we finding that they're so much more than when we seek private quotes?
So there are definitely vendors that are kind of what I'll call like the middlemen and women of the world, that like they own an organization where they have the services, funds, and employees to be able to apply for the Express Grant and get them on the list. Often I see that like at least $100 per person is added on there. I don't know. I haven't looked at what those additional points are, but they're also probably thinking about it from an open enrollment perspective. So rather than like, okay, it costs us, $2,500 to run a 4-hour session. But if we're doing open enrollment, we only want and we can only guarantee 4 people that are going to participate. We need to make sure that we're getting our $2,500 with 4 people but we could also have 30 people in that room. And so that's where I find that sometimes that open enrollment ends up inflating the pricing based off of the lowest possible denominator.
Awesome. That context is really helpful. And then this is a really interesting nuanced question. So what does the process look like for an individual or employee who is looking to participate in professional development training? How can they make a personal case that the opportunity that they're looking for is in alignment with the overall business goals? And will they need support from their employer in order to submit an application? I know that was a 3-parter, so let me know if I need to.
So once again, I tend to try and if you're an individual and you might not be able to think about the overall learning journey as a whole, and you're in Massachusetts, because I know we have a lot of Massachusetts folks here, try for that Express Grant. If you go, there is a directory, and you can literally, let me just super quickly pull it up, that you can type in topics that you want to cover. So if you scroll down, where is it? What happened here? There's normally extra buttons here, and they are not here for some reason. Well, there is normally a directory up here, and maybe they're updating it right now. And you can type in manager development, you can type in plan reading, you can type in emotional intelligence, whatever you want to type in, and then things will pop up based off of that. And if you can find that there's a training that's on there, you could go to your HR person or your manager and say, listen, I want to do this training, and we can get it fully reimbursed. With the Express Grant, you don't need to have a business case that aligns. You just need to apply. You do need a certificate of good standing, and you need a contact from your organization. So ideally, your manager, the CEO, an HR person can apply for you. But if you go to them by being hey, this is here, I did my research, this is the program, it can be fully reimbursed, and here are the steps to do it, which are covered down here. I think that's a pretty good case to be made. So I'll leave you with that.
Great. And then the last question that we have for you is, what grants can a global organization take advantage of, given that they are designing programs for developing employees in 10 different countries?
I wish there was a good answer there, but we don't play that nice in the sandbox globally just yet, and nor do we do it nationally as a whole. And so from a training grant perspective, there might be other training grants that are outside of the unemployment realm. I am not currently an expert in that. I am happy to send over links for grant writers that might be able to research additional programs outside of that. Our focus is around the unemployment and being a proactive unemployment realm. And because of that, that is state focused. I will say that we have a client that is an international organization. They have 10,000 employees around the world, if not 40,000, somewhere in that range. I don't exactly remember. And so we just applied for their Massachusetts, or we just applied for their New York City, or we just applied for their California office. It doesn't fully allow for everyone to participate in the same thing, but if their like international training department is on the same page with us, then they might be like, hey, our overall budget is $2 million. However, but if we could get 200,000 of it saved for Massachusetts, that would be huge. And so they could help us align what their business goals are globally, and we could see if we could just focus on providing training funds for that state, or for multiple states. Awesome question.
Well, those are all the questions that we had. I just wanted to take a minute to thank you, Krista, Fatima, Carly. Thank you so much for giving a really succinct, but I know clear overview on what training grants are available, how folks can take advantage of services both at Building People and here at SGO. And thanks you all for joining us today. You all asked some amazing questions. As I mentioned, this recording will be sent out, so you'll be able to have that along with contact information for both She Geeks Out and Building People. But thank you all again so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.